Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director of the Orchestra Nationale de Lille and the chief conductor of the England Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive into this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Scott and Joanne, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. I am in Aalborg this week with the England Symphony doing a really nice program with Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique and Bartók's Second Violin Concerto with Ning Feng, the absolutely amazing violinist. There will also be this week a live podcast with Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique with the England Symphony, which I will be putting up in a few weeks. Then the following week, I will be in Lille doing a half American, half French program with Ravel's La Valse and Tombeau de Couperin. And then the first half will have Gershwin's Concerto in F with Lise de la Salle performing the solo piano part, and then Ives's Three Places in New England. This is a piece that I've covered before on the show, but it is one of my absolute favorite pieces of American music. I think it is a great insight into how American music developed over the 20th century, and it's just always great to spend an hour with Charles Ives, one of the most interesting, one of the most innovative and creative composers of all time. Really hope you enjoy this one. In 1929, the conductor Nicolas Slonimsky contacted the American composer Charles Ives about performing one of his works. This was a bit of a surprise for Ives, since he had a checkered reputation among musicians and audience members, if they even were familiar with his name at all. In fact, Ives was much more famous during his lifetime as an extremely successful insurance executive. Ives mostly composed in his spare time, and his music was mostly ignored or ridiculed as that of a person suffering from a crisis of mental health. Most of his music was never performed during his lifetime, and even today he is thought of as a great but extremely eccentric composer, and orchestras and chamber ensembles often struggle to sell tickets if his name appears on the program. But for those who love Ives, there is almost an evangelical desire to spread his music to the world, and I'm one of those people. And I'm finally fulfilling a pledge to myself to do a full show devoted to a single work of arguably the greatest and most underappreciated American composer of all time, Charles Ives. The piece I chose to talk about today is Three Places in New England, or the New England Symphony, a piece that is a perfect amalgam of what makes Ives such a spectacular composer. His radical innovations, his ahead-of-his-time experiments, his humor, his humanity, his warmth, and the staggering creativity that marked all of Ives's greatest works. We'll start with a little biography of Ives in case you're not familiar with him, and then we'll dive into Three Places in New England. And by the end, I hope, if you're not already, that I will have converted you into an Ives fan for life. All this and more is coming right up on Sticky Notes. I think the best way to describe Ives's upbringing in music is to tell you this. As a child, Charles Ives was often brought to the Danbury, Connecticut town square by his father, George. George was a band leader during the Civil War and was a conductor, director, teacher, and all-around Renaissance man in the Danbury area. One of George's favorite pastimes was to take two of his marching bands, place them at opposite ends of the town square, and have them march towards each other, playing two different songs. He would then often tell his son Charles to try to write down the music that he heard in the cacophony. This kind of irreverent style would be a huge influence on Ives's music, though he was also heavily influenced by church hymns, gospel music, and American folk songs as well. One of his first works was a series of organ variations, later orchestrated, on the tune America, a tune that is probably pretty familiar to you and which has taken on a bit of extra relevance over the past couple of years. Ives studied at Yale and continued to compose on the side, writing one of his most famously irreverent works while there, the Yale-Princeton football game. After college, Ives became an insurance executive and ran his own company, Ives and Myrick, until his retirement. All along this time, Ives was composing, mostly for himself and a few friends who would play his music privately. You might expect an insurance executive who didn't have a lot of formal training except from his father, who wasn't a composition teacher, to write in a somewhat conservative style. And at first, that's actually exactly what happened. His first symphony sounds like an American attempt at Brahms, which makes sense, since it was written just at the end of the 19th century. But very soon, Ives was composing wildly experimental music. His most well-known work is probably The Unanswered Question, a piece written for strings, four flutes, and trumpet. The Unanswered Question was written between 1906 and 1908, something that is just astounding to me, considering that Mahler was still alive, Dvorak had just died, Brahms had only been dead for 9 years, and Stravinsky and Schoenberg had barely begun the experiments that would rock the Western classical music world. The Unanswered Question is program music, but in the inimitable manner of Ives. Ives sets up three characters: the strings, who represent the silence of the Druids, who know, see, and hear nothing, and the strings play gorgeous and extremely quiet chords that never react to anything else going on. The trumpet poses the perennial question of existence 7 times, in a phrase that is completely atonal and unrelated to the strings, a concept that would have been foreign to almost any audience and honestly most composers in 1908. The four flute players begin to try to answer the question, and as Ives says, they, quote, eventually realize futility and begin to mock the question. The piece ends with the undisturbed solitude of the Druids. The unanswered question is one of the most stunning works of the 20th century, and due to Ives being completely shut out of most performance spaces until well after his death, it was not even heard until 1946. There's so much more about Charles Ives that I could tell you about, but I want to get into the three places in New England now. But if you do want to know more about Ives as a person and as a composer, I have two long interviews, one with Jan Swafford and one with John Heiss, back in the archives, that go extensively into this American Mavericks music. Swafford and Heiss are two of the premier experts on Ives, so I learned a lot from these conversations, and I hope you will too. Okay, now on to the three places in New England. Like many of Ives's compositions, this piece is a pastiche and had a very unclear origin story. You could say that this piece was being written and or completed anywhere from 1903 to 1929. There are multiple versions of the piece for different instrumentations, and Ives never specified which he preferred. And it is also difficult to tell sometimes which version corresponds to which, as Ives would cut out real pieces of his original manuscript score for his revisions and then glue them onto other ones. So modern editors like James Sinclair have tried with painstaking effort to piece together all of Ives's changes. Ives changed metronome markings, changed dynamics, changed movement titles, changed the order of the movements, changed the name of the piece, took out measures, added them back in again, and more. And all of this is completely typical for Ives, which makes his music a nightmare for editors, but also a lot of fun for the performer, who has to piece together their own individual version of this piece, and actually do that with all of Ives's works. He left so much up to the performer, and he was very proud of this. After the very first performance of Three Places in New England, Ives came backstage and told the performers, quote, "Just like a town meeting, every man for himself. Wonderful how it came out." The closest to the final version of the original idea of the Three Places in New England was completed in 1914. But Ives had started working on the second of the three movements as early as 1903, and wrote the first and third movements in 1911. The movements can be performed separately as well, something that is sometimes done with the second of the three movements, Putnam's Camp. The first movement is by far the longest of the three, and is the most unusual and perhaps the most Ivesian. It is entitled The St. Gaudens in Boston Common, and in parentheses, Colonel Shaw and His Colored Regiment. Ives experimented with plenty of other titles for this movement, like Boston Common, Impression of the St. Gaudens, The Black March, and more. It's typical of Ives to have been constantly tweaking with these titles. Here's how it begins. In this performance by the NEC Philharmonia with my former teacher, Hugh Wolfe. The movement is a depiction, though an abstract one, of the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial Monument that still stands today in Boston Common. It was created by Augustus St. Gaudens and stands just across the street from City Hall in Boston. The monument was built in honor of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was the second all-black regiment that served in the Union Army during the American Civil War. Robert Gould Shaw, their white commander and the son of Boston abolitionists, led the regiment in their storming of Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where 272 of the 600 men were killed or wounded in battle, including Shaw himself. This was a regiment that was later honored for their valor in the war and became somewhat legendary. It was the 54th Regiment that featured in the movie Glory, and St. Gaudens was one of many who memorialized the bravery and dedication of these soldiers. The governor of Massachusetts at the time, John A. Andrews, said, quote, "I know not where, in all of human history, to any given 1,000 men in arms, there has been committed a work at once so proud, so precious, so full of hope and glory." I recommend you take a minute to Google this monument before listening further, as it's one of the most stirring memorials of its kind that I know of, and every time I'm in Boston, I try to go and see it. There's something so stark about the materials used, and the looks on the faces of the soldiers as they seemingly head towards that fateful battle in South Carolina. This look is what I think Ives was trying to portray as he laid out the first movement of his Three Places in New England. The movement is what Ives described as a black march, and I think he means this in more ways than one. Obviously, he's depicting black soldiers marching, but there's also a darkness to the scene that Ives is portraying that reminds one of the blackness of the night, the darkness of war, and the trudging through the mud, blood, and sweat that the soldiers endured. Listen to the heaviness of the music, and especially listen for the extremely soft accompaniment in the basses, a slightly offbeat rhythm that depicts the stumbling of the soldiers through the mud. I said that the Three Places in New England is a pastiche, but the first movement is actually a pastiche of a pastiche, and that Ives is about to use fragments of American folk songs, hymns, plantation songs, parlor songs, and more in his recreation of the 54th Regiment's march. This is yet another meaning of Ives's Black March, a musical depiction of the songs sung as the soldiers marched. Over the course of this movement, you will hear long-forgotten songs, such as Masters in the Cold Ground, Old Black Joe, The Battle Cry of Freedom, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, Yes, Jesus Loves Me, and probably a dozen more unidentified tunes. The most prominent, if you can call it that song at first, is Old Black Joe by Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster is certainly a controversial name today, but during the 19th century, he might have been the most popular songwriter in the country. He was famous for songs like Camptown Races, My Old Kentucky Home, and many more. At the same time, he wrote lots of his music for pre-Civil War minstrel shows, and some of his lyrics are extraordinarily outdated and offensive. But his legacy is complicated by the fact that many of his songs, offensive terminology included, also express sympathy to the plight of slaves, in the context of pre-Civil War era American writing. And thinkers such as Frederick Douglass and singers such as Paul Robeson extolled the power of some of Foster's lyrics as, quote, awakening sympathies for the slave, in which anti-slavery principles take root, grow, and flourish. Foster in 2022 is a complicated topic, but I'm not going to address it much more here, as Ives was also writing at a completely different time, and it is abundantly clear that Ives is writing from a place of total admiration for this group of soldiers and the monument they inspired. Now here is the song Old Black Joe, as sung by Paul Robeson.
cotton fields away, gone from the earth to a better land I know. I hear those gentle voices calling, poor old Joe. I'm coming, for my head is bending low.
Ives, in his unique style, doesn't just take these songs like Old Black Joe and quote them directly. Instead, he takes fragments of these songs and intersperses them amongst the haze of the early part of this first movement. The part of the song that Ives takes from most prominently is this.
I'm coming, for my head.
Now you might be thinking, I didn't hear anything that sounded like that in the first clip of the Ives you played us. Never fear, it is there. Listen again, it's blended in with the dissonant harmonies of the accompaniment, and it's much, much slower. But very stretched out, you will hear the notes.
I'm coming,
This slow march continues with the Old Black Joe song being the most prominent part of the melody. As I said, I've had the great pleasure of speaking with John Heiss about performing this piece, and he has always encouraged me to think of this music like American Brahms. Soft, yes, but deeply expressive. An expression of these soldiers' bravery and eventual suffering. As I play you the next clip, keep listening out for those words. I'm coming. Ives wrote a poem to go along with this movement. Moving, marching, faces of souls, marked with generations of pain, part freers of a destiny, slowly, restlessly, swaying us on with you towards other freedom. The man on horseback carved from a native quarry of the word liberty, and from what your country was made. You images of a divine law, carved in the shadow of a saddened heart, never light abandon, of an age and of a nation. Above and beyond that compelling mass rises the drumbeat of the common heart, in the silence of a strange and sounding afterglow, moving, marching, faces of souls. Throughout this movement, you will notice, I'm sure, the dissonant harmonies. But if you're trying to follow the music, try to imagine it cinematically. From time to time, a short and crisp rhythm will appear, like in this moment I'm about to play for you. It's as if the soldiers suddenly start marching faster for a moment, only to fall back into their trudge. Another clear allusion that Ives makes is to the Union Army battle cry of freedom.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hills and we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys.
Here it is in the piece, again slowed down like a nostalgic memory of what was, and in the minds of the soldiers, what they are fighting for. The second section of the movement is a bit faster, and here Ives says, quote, "From here on, though with animation, still slowly and rather evenly. Often when a mass of men march uphill, there is an unconscious slowing up. The drum seems to follow the feet, rather than the feet, the drum." Usually at this point I tell the musicians to play as if they think my tempo is too fast. A trick that gets the tempo to move because I'm conducting faster, but also with resistance, exactly the sound that I think Ives was going for. In this section, Ives combines the Union Forever song with the I'm Coming motif to create an achingly expressive scene. But now the march becomes much more agitated, as if the lines have been broken, and it is here where Ives starts to write his increasingly complex rhythms, one that give orchestras fits. All the same, the march continues, barely audible underneath the agitation. We hear a military fanfare before it is quickly snuffed out, and the music stops momentarily, before continuing on, as tired as before. But then we start to reach the top of the hill. The way that Ives orchestrates this section is quite raw, with brass playing almost in unison and the strings in their most shrill gestures, with a flute screeching above it all. It is a victory to get to the top of this hill, but it comes at a cost. There is a blast, a flash of one, of C major, victory. But then the triumph is cut short, and Ives writes another complex rhythm that to me suggests ragged breathing. That screeching flute now transforms into a lonely mezzo-soprano, as we get the clearest and most audible version of the Union Forever song, over an exhausted and yet expressive string melody and march rhythm. Now, a normal march rhythm would have been bum, 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 bum. But Ives takes the tempo down to almost half as fast as that. It's like a march viewed through a distorted lens, the lens of history perhaps, or through the image of the monument itself. And there's another aspect to this. the battle cry of freedom is also very close in pitch and contour to the spiritual "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," and Ives revels in this ambiguity. As he once said, quote, "Let me be very, very clear about this. I love ambiguity." Soon we seem to be either leaving the monument ourselves or watching the soldiers march off into the distance. The rhythm continues, but it gets softer and softer as the strings start to rise higher in their registers, as if the strains of these songs are getting further and further away. Finally, we are left with a single trumpet, quietly intoning, "I'm coming," and the music ends with a clear allusion to an amen. The march, the prayer, the meditation is over. Ives was under no illusions to how this movement would be received, and it's certainly the most challenging of the set, as you'll soon see. But I think following along with these folk songs, as unfamiliar as they are now to us in 2022, is the way to understand this movement, along with the constant soft drumbeat of the marching soldiers. I've said this about the movement, quote, "This can never be played or make sense to anyone." I hope I've proved him just a little bit wrong. The second movement of the Three Places in New England is actually the oldest movement. In 1903, Ives wrote 2 theater orchestra pieces that would become the second movement of this piece, Putnam's Camp. The first was called Country Band March. The second was called Overture and March 1776. Pretty different, right? Well, how did Ives end up deciding to make these 2 disparate works into one? Well, James Sinclair, the editor of the score of Three Places, and quite the Ives expert himself, theorizes that Ives was enjoying working on another piece entitled 4th of July, which was also using bits and pieces of the 1776 march. And he perhaps came up with the idea of joining up the country band and the 1776 march together. Anyway, this was totally in keeping with Ives' upbringing, where, as I told you, he would regularly hear 2 bands playing different pieces at the same time. So what Ives ended up with is 2 outer sections which borrow heavily from the country band march, and a middle section which uses the Overture and March 1776. But that's not even close to all. Instead of just the silly march, Ives imagined an entire scene in Revolutionary War-era Connecticut. And in fact, this movement is an example of program music, where the music tells a story as it goes. Though the story is a pretty weird one. I'll tell it to you as we go through this remarkable movement. Here's how it begins. It might be hard to tell, but the second measure of this movement drives orchestras and conductors absolutely crazy. The problem is that Ives liked to make fun of amateur bands which had bad rhythm, or a drunk percussionist, or whatever, and so he adds an eighth note to the second beat of the bar, which creates that little hitch. Well-trained classical musicians are often at a loss of how to do this, as it just sounds wrong. And what Ives achieves by doing this hitch is that for 2 bars, the orchestra sounds like it's not together, but it is. And then with another hitch, they right the ship and the melody can go along. This is actually one of the few original melodies in this movement, as whatever I told you about borrowings in the first movement are taken to a new level by Ives in the second movement. But back to the story. Ives says, quote, "Once upon a 4th of July, some time ago, so the story goes, a child went to Putnam's camp on a picnic. Wandering away from the rest of the children past the campground into the woods, he hopes to catch a glimpse of some of the old soldiers." Now, what I adore about this is how Ives is able to make it seem like the boy is hearing songs and music coming from all different directions. He even portrays the drunken ramblings of some of the soldiers, as the rhythm swerves in all different directions. First you have these offbeat hiccups. And did you hear what was over the top of that? It's the British Grenadiers March. Listen for the flute and oboe screeching it out. Then Ives writes triplets that smear their way over the bar lines, like things that have become a bit tipsy, and then they write themselves again. And then things get really wild. In the next passage, Ives quotes from no less than 5 patriotic or otherwise American folk songs, all at the same time. I'll play you the passage and then try to pull it apart. We have Masters in the Cold Ground, played by the flute. We have Arkansas Traveler, played by the trumpet. We have Semper Fidel in the trombone. We have King Cotton in the violas. And then the violas seem to forget about that and switch to the Washington Post March. And all at the same time, Ives' own original theme is playing. Listen now to the whole thing together. Now, did you catch that? We had a bit of the Union Forever and then 8 notes of Yankee Doodle. Listen again. And all of that results in the most innocent music of all, something you might have heard in a Revolutionary War era pub. But soon the story must move on, and Ives tells us this. Quote, "As he rests on the hillside of laurel and hickories, the tunes of the band and the songs of the children grow fainter and fainter." Now listen to how Ives slows the music down until it seems to actually be falling asleep. Now the 1776 march appears, and Ives tells us this, quote, "Over the trees on the crest of the hill he sees a tall woman standing. She reminds him of a picture he has of the goddess of liberty, but the face is sorrowful. She is pleading with the soldiers not to forget their cause and the great sacrifices they have made for it. But they march out of camp with fife and drum to a popular tune of the day." Now, in order to portray this, Ives copies his father's influence and actually writes out two groups of instruments playing two different tunes at the same time in different tempos. We have the Goddess of Liberty theme pleading with the soldiers. And that is set in one tempo. And then Ives has the snare drum, piano, and trumpet to play the popular tune of the day, the Grenadiers, in fragments. Ives finds a way to sort of line this up, but the idea is that the music is completely disoriented, almost like it's being heard in a dream, which is what Ives is describing. The story continues with the line, quote, "Suddenly a new national note is heard." Ives has taken the march rhythm that has been going simultaneously and has made that the new tempo for this new national note. The Grenadiers' march appears again, and as Ives says, quote, "Putnam is coming over the hills from the center. The soldiers turn back and cheer." And here's where I think that cheer is. And now things again are about to get really, really wild and rambunctious. First, Ives bizarrely quotes from Bizet's Carmen. And now I really wish I could show you the score here. There are 7 things happening at once, with rhythms you might need a math degree to play exactly correctly, and the result is what John Heiss described as a free-for-all, but one that is extremely carefully composed. These wild juxtapositions are what makes this movement just simply so fun to listen to. In Ives' story, the boy wakes up, hears this song, and then runs down past the monument to listen to the band and join in the games and dances. The final minute or so of the movement is the portrayal of the increasing wildness of those games and dances. And Ives starts to layer the country band march on top of the 1776 march, though in such a way that, honestly, it's almost impossible to hear it. So this piece is almost as much fun to study as a piece of musical architecture as it is to perform it or to listen to it. Here comes my favorite moment of the piece, though I warn you, it's not easy to hear it. In this next passage, Ives will do 3 major things all at the same time. We have the Grenadier March and the trumpet, so listen to that for a moment. The Then the violins are playing the country band march. And those are the two easier things to hear, because in the background, and this is so essential for performers to try to bring out, the percussion and the upper winds are playing a waltz rhythm. Try to hear it, especially in the percussion, the accents on 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, against the 1, 2, 3, 4 of the rhythm. Isn't that amazing? Ives' music always has more and more layers you can dig down into, creating endless fun for performers and listeners alike as you listen to this piece again and again. And now the party becomes completely out of control. Ives liked to have fun with his performers as well, and in one passage, which sounds like this, Ives wrote that the music should be played lively, with a kind of lilt. This sort of wry humor helps us performers forgive him for writing such incredibly difficult music. At one point, he tells the bassist to just play with a, quote, broken rumble, which I've interpreted to be basically pressing the bow as hard as possible into the string. Everyone always loves doing that. And finally, the scene seems to dissolve into a whirlwind of cacophony. It's one of the noisiest things you'll ever hear in a concert hall. Ives writes for the music to be played as fast as playable, and just before the end, he includes one last little joke. See if you can catch it. Did you hear it? I'll isolate it for you. It's the first 4 notes of the American national anthem in heavily distorted harmony. Ives says to make just a small slowing down for this ending, but I like to do quite a bit, so it's really clear that the national anthem gets played for just a moment before the trumpet, sticking his tongue out, ends this raucous and rambunctious movement, one of Ives' greatest achievements. Ives wrote the third movement, the Housatonic at Stockbridge, after a walk with his wife Harmony along the Housatonic River. They were recently married, and the experience of this walk left a mark on Ives that he would immortalize in this final movement of the piece. He wrote, quote, "We walked in the meadows along the river and heard the distant singing from the church across the river. The mist had not entirely left the riverbed, and the colors, the running water, the banks, and the elm trees were something that one would always remember." Ives also quoted from a poem written by Robert Underwood Johnson. It's quite a long poem, but I'll read you the first few lines of it. "Contented river, in thy dreamy realm, the cloudy willow and the plumy elm, those have grown human laboring with men, at wheel and spindle, sorrow thou dost ken. Thou beautiful, from every dreamy hill, what eye but wanders with thee at thy will? Imagining thy silver course unseen, convoyed by 2 attendant streams of green." It's a beautiful poem, and Ives was clearly inspired by it to write one of his most beautiful movements. For all of Ives' irreverence and humor and silliness, he was often quite sentimental and nostalgic. And this movement is a perfect amalgam of both Ives' startling originality and his ability to write gorgeous and heartbreakingly beautiful music. But first, Ives begins the movement by creating that mist over the riverbed that he described in his walk along the river. What Ives has done is created that mist out of the strings playing 5 different rhythms at the same time, extremely softly. The rhythm of the first violin part is so complicated that a simplified version is often used just to give the violins a chance, but it has no effect on the remarkable color that Ives creates. That is the mist, and then the cellos and basses of the riverbed, playing loudly enough, Ives says, to make the misty violins and violas fall into the background. And soon a French horn begins the theme, which matches syllable for syllable the poem. I won't subject you to my singing voice again, but think about contented river when the horn comes in. The theme that Ives is using is not his own, but an amalgamation of 2 hymn tunes, the most prominent of which is Dorrance by Isaac B. Woodbury. Ives expands this theme out to fit the words of the poem, as if this was the hymn he and his wife heard in the distance as they walked along the Housatonic River. This is a somewhat invented scene, as it wouldn't really have been possible for them to have heard the choir singing, but it creates a remarkably touching scene, with the hymn seeming to come through the mist, immovable and immortal. This river may be contented, but Ives also quotes from later sections of Johnson's poem, where things begin to become a bit more unsettled. To match this section of the poem, contented river and yet over shy, to mask thy beauty from the eager eye. Hast thou a thought to hide from field and town, in some deep current of the sunlit brown? Art thou disquieted, still uncontent? Ives brings in the violins, who play in a much more agitated manner than the horn and English horn did at the beginning of the movement. The winds also join in with the mist, making it swirl ever more, as if the river itself is being obscured even as it becomes more unsettled. And then to match the line, ah, there's a restive ripple. All hell breaks loose once more. Ives builds the music to a cacophony that rivals the second movement's chaos, but this time, instead of raucous wildness, the music should be beautiful, warm, and ecstatic. It's hard to imagine that seeming scream as ecstatic, But listening to this music in this way requires us to throw out our ideas of what beautiful music is, because Ives revels in both the purely tonal and the mashing up of chords in what should be pure dissonance, but instead, in my mind, is pure ecstasy. The excerpt of the poem finishes with, "Wouldst thou away, dear stream? Come whisper near. I also of much resting have a fear. Let me tomorrow thy companion be, by fall and shallow, to the adventurous sea." If you've ever been near a waterfall, you know how the water suddenly seems to speed up of its own accord, before seemingly gleefully rushing over the side and down the fall. That's the image I get at this moment in the third movement, a moment as dissonant, as wild, and as beautiful as nature itself. But the piece is not over. Emerging from the cluster chord are 4 string players, playing as softly as possible. A brief amen chord that Ives specifies should emerge and disappear as quickly as possible. It's as if we close our eyes after seeing the rushing river and try to imprint it on our memories. Or as if we've awoken from the dream, with only a brief moment to remember what we saw. As I said at the beginning of the show, Ives wrote this piece between 1903 and 1914. It's absolutely remarkable to hear the innovations and experiments that Ives was working with during that period, a period of immense change in the musical world. But Ives might have been more revolutionary than all of the composers pushing the envelope at the time, like Schoenberg and Stravinsky. But Ives's music was utterly ignored. The Three Places in New England wasn't performed until 1929. It was his first so-called success and became his first published orchestral score. But even then, it was almost never performed until the 1970s, when it was rediscovered and a small Ives renaissance began, which continues to this day. Ives doesn't sell out concert halls, and his music often divides listeners. One of my favorite post-concert moments of my life came when I heard my family's trio, the Weilerstein Trio, perform Ives's remarkable piano trio at a concert in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. I went to the bathroom at intermission and I overheard one audience member say to another as they were washing their hands, "That's the worst thing I've ever heard." But the response surprised me. "Really? I loved it. It's so creative." That's Ives in a nutshell. The writer Gilbert Chase described Ives's problem as suffering from, quote, "congenital originality in a climate of conformity." I hope today that I've shown you the beauty of Ives's music, the originality of it, the joy of it, and the irreverent and yet often friendly face of this American maverick, Charles Ives.
There's a time in many a life when it's due to face it death, but our soldier boy.
Thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you next week, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on iTunes. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.
They are there, they are there, they are there, good and deep. As the Allies beat up all of our hearts, the boys be there fighting hard, and then the world will shout the battle cry of freedom, chanting on a new camp ground.